Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, Eclectic Album Reviews, and General Musical Meanderings. I found myself recently sort of re-interested in the 90s, the music of the 90s. And one of the albums that was really important to me in the early 90s was Morphine's Cure for Pain. This is actually an album that I listened to a whole lot when it came out in 1993. I was sort of in a hiatus from school, and I was spending a lot of time like trying to decide what I wanted to do with myself. And I think Morphine's sort of free-spirited approach to music, an introspective feel, was really appealing to me. Morphine made an immediate impression on me whenever I first heard them because, and if you know anything about them, this was one of their big selling points. They're a very uniquely instrumented band. They're a trio, maybe the world's quirkiest power trio for sure, because the bass player, Mark Sandman, the lead singer and bass player Mark Sandman, played a 2-string bass of his own formulation with a slide on it. And then we had a baritone sax player, Dana Colley, and a drummer. It's a trio. And despite the fact that sounds like very sparse instrumentation, Morphine really, really made it work. By all logic, that instrumentation should not have worked as well as it did. But the vision of the group and Mark Sandman's concept, both his musical concept and his songwriting concept, and the way that he was able to pull the Jerome Dupree, the drummer, and Dana Colley, the saxophone player, into that orbit and get them to collaborate on his songs was really a winning formula. The chemistry between those three musicians is undeniable, and it's expressed most clearly, I think, on Cure for Pain.
It's a sacrifice, and tell me where is the faith? Someday there'll be a cure for pain.
If you like the way that the sound works, all their albums are great. They all sound good, but something is very special about Cure for Pain and the songwriting on it and the way that the whole thing worked. So Morphine wasn't really part of this main narrative of Nirvana and the grunge scene or whatever. They stood pretty far outside of it, but that allowed them to be really their own group. And this was an identity. The band's identity was something that Mark Sandman had kind of been formulating for a while. He's a very interesting character. There's been some documentary work on the guy, and there's movies about him and a lot of talks. And if you go and listen to interviews with him, he's a very, very articulate and smart person, but also kind of elusive, and kind of gives you the sense of being like an out of time beat poet in a funny way. By all accounts, he was a guy that was willing to connect but not really share. And he had a musical vision that stretched way back to his youth. He had a falling out with his parents because he really wanted to follow his vision for being a musician. And his father was a very, very smart, shrewd businessman and didn't really understand what Mark Sandman's his story was. So Mark ran away from home, essentially, and then roamed the country for a really long time. He was an Alaskan fisherman for a while, and eventually ended his roaming the Western Hemisphere in South America and Brazil. So if that gives you any kind of idea about the breadth of his experiences, it's pretty astounding overall. And this is the thing about his music and his musicianship. He's a very, very accomplished musician, but it's not the kind of musicianship that you would get in school. It's the kind of musicianship that's garnered from life experiences. And clearly he set out to find those experiences. And along the way during this experience, this is where he formulated his idea about having a 2-string bass. So it was not just like he sat down with the bass one day and just tore the 2 of the strings off and started playing. It was something that he worked on. He was very inspired by old blues, like the idea that there were these bluesmen that could do these amazing things with just one string. It goes all the way back to early African American instruments, the Diddley Bow, things like that. Mark Sandman was really into this idea of having just a one-string bass. And then, if you listen to his accounts to it, eventually he graduated to 2 strings. As a person who has played some bass and likes the feeling of frets and strings, the idea of interacting with the bass in this way is very foreign to me, and I have a lot of respect for him being able to do it so well and sing at the same time and write songs in this format. If you've got a slide on this thing, you're playing bass with in fifths, with a slide going up and down, actually hitting the notes where they're supposed to be while you're singing is no small feat. And from a performance standpoint, he always nailed it, and he definitely was coming at the instrument like he wanted to master that particular way of playing. And it's unique. It's not normal bass playing. It's not like funky bass line stuff. It has its own thing. But it's also a thing I think that ties very closely back to old blues. And it expresses itself, I think, in Morphine is a very strong characteristic of the group.
I hear a voice in the back of the room.
But he's not by himself there. Of course, he has a baritone saxophone player, Dana Colley, who's in himself extremely inventive, and the way that they interact with each other, the way they play melodies together, is super duper compelling and has a lot of strength and a lot of muscle to it. And if you think about it in a live setting, that means that Morphine really could only produce 4 discrete pitches at once. A 1 string and a 2nd string, his voice, Mark Sandman's voice, and the saxophone player's saxophone. There was a while where a saxophone player was kind of doing the 2 saxophone gag for a while, so that would give them another pitch. But the harmonic complexity was not what they were about. Certainly, the saxophone and the voice could fill in some sort of tonality in those open fifths. But really, it was all pentatonic, very, very kind of atonal in some ways with their music. But the riffs were super solid, and the melodies were great. Now, Cure for Pain itself definitely has a live feel to it. And I think that they were really able to capture that aspect of their performance in the creation of this album. There are some overdubs on there, making a big deal about how sparse they made things. There's a couple of background vocals here and there. And there's every now and then there'll be 2 saxophone parts. They're just using that to kind of fill things out. But generally speaking, they still keep that kind of sparse feel to it. Song for song across the board, all the tracks on Cure for Pain are phenomenal. And again, if this is one of those albums where if you like one of the songs, you'll probably like all of them. And the only exception really is the song In Spite of Me, which doesn't really feature Mark Sandman's normal bass playing. It's like a mandolin part. It almost gets into some real classic Led Zeppelin territory at that point.
Last night I told a stranger all about you. They smiled patiently with disbelief. I always knew you would succeed no matter what you tried, and I know you did it all in spite of me.
But aside from that track, Morphine attacks these songs really powerfully, but are still give the impression that what they're doing is mellow and dark and smoky. But really it's a very aggressive album overall, and it's the instrumentation that they use and actually just the sort of overall tessitura of the group that gives it that feel. Mark Sandman quite famously called Morphine style low rock. And he's got this deep baritone voice. They've got a bass and a bari sax, and the drummer's playing. He's playing drums. It's mostly a lot of toms and stuff. He likes to use toms, so they kept that aesthetic throughout this album, throughout all of their albums. This is part of their whole kind of their shtick in a way. But given these limitations, they flourished, and those limitations were self-imposed in an attempt to kind of find ways to be creative within the limitations that they provided for themselves. Mark Sandman's lyrics are also a component of the success of of Cure for Pain. And I think of many of their albums, the lyrics on Cure for Pain are particularly vivid. But many of these songs tell stories about things that that surround him or that he's feeling that are certainly things I think that the average person can relate to. One of my favorite songs on Cure for Pain is Thursday, which was sort of my fight song during that time I lived in Austin, because I had a group of friends. We'd get together. We would get together on Tuesdays, and we would go and hang out and do stuff.
We used to meet every Thursday in the afternoon for a couple of beers and a game of pool. We used to go to a motel across the street, and the name of the motel was the Wagon Wheel.
It'd be a real shame if Cure for Pain kind of ended up being lost to history, because it's actually kind of such a distinctive, unique thing, and that really could have only happened in the 90s, almost in opposition to what was happening in the mainstream music scene. They were an alternative band. And if you ever have questions about where the term alternative came from, Morphine is one of those groups I think that defines what the genre was intended to be, even though it kind of got taken over by other ideas later on. So, love Cure for Pain. Everybody should check this album out. And that's all I got on it this week. So, if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and then share it out with your friends. Catch me over on Spotify. I'll put a Morphine track up over there. And until next week, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.
Wow.